Joe Costa sat at the table, her father. James across from her with a cold, calculating stare. No greeting, no pleasantries, just a contract shoved in her face. He didn't care about how she was or what she had been through. To him, she was just another asset to exploit, another financial lever to pull. The words that came next were chilling: sign the papers or he'd destroy everything she'd worked for. But Jo wasn't the scared little girl anymore. She had spent the last few years building her empire, turning rejection into a strength. Tonight, she was about to teach her father a lesson he would never forget. The tension in the room was suffocating, and Jo was at the crossroads: sign and submit, or stand her ground and fight back. The pen hovered and she made her decision. The power was in her hands now. This wasn't just about money. This was personal. This was the moment Jo would take control. Jo leaned back in her chair, her eyes unfocused, as memories began to rise like ghosts in the shadows of the room. It wasn't the first time her father had tried to tear her down. His betrayal had begun long before tonight, long before this confrontation. 3 years ago, just a day before her wedding, Jo had received an eviction notice for her wedding venue. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a clerical error. James, her father, owned the building through a shell company, and he canceled the lease. He wanted to remind her who had the power, and it was a lesson she would never forget. He'd thought the humiliation would break her, make her crawl back to him, beg for a second chance. But Jo didn't beg, not anymore. Instead, she and Caleb had rushed to City Hall to marry with Jo in a dress. She picked off the rack an hour before the ceremony. Everything she'd imagined for that day family love celebration had been shattered by the callousness of the man she had once looked up to as a father. The cold reality set in. Then her father didn't see her as a daughter. She was just another pawn in his game of control. That was when Jo began to build her strength, brick by brick, turning rejection into her foundation. Her wedding was the beginning of her rise, not the end. She didn't need him. She was better without him. But the deepest betrayal came later. When her mother fell ill, Jo had asked her father for help. It was a simple request, one that should have been answered without hesitation. There was an experimental treatment in Switzerland that could save her mother's life. It was expensive, but Jo knew her father had the resources. The company was doing fine, he said. He had the means to help. But when Jo asked him for the money, he told her the company had cash flow issues. He couldn't spare the capital. And so Jo had sat by her mother's bedside watching her fade away, helpless and heartbroken. She whispered assurances to her mother, telling her everything would be okay. She held her hand as she passed, mourning the loss of the woman who had always been her rock. But the betrayal didn't end there. 2 weeks after her mother's funeral, Jo's brother Thomas posted a picture on Instagram, a brand new Porsche. It was a graduation gift from their father, the same man who had turned his back on his wife's life-saving treatment. The anger Jo felt was searing, but it was nothing compared to the cold realization that followed. Her father had chosen a car for his son over his wife's life, and that was when Jo's grief turned to something far darker. That was when she realized she had to stop being the victim in her father's twisted games. She had to stop hoping he would change, stop wishing he would finally see her as more than just a liability. So she made a decision. She wasn't going to cry anymore. She was going to fight. Jo didn't take the traditional route. She didn't scream, didn't shout. Instead, she hired forensic accountants, hired the best in the business, and began to track every dollar that flowed through her father's empire. She watched as he leveraged the company, his house, his reputation, all to maintain the appearance of wealth and power. He was the master of illusions, but Joe was learning how to see through them. As she sat across from him now, she realized just how far he had fallen. To him, this was all a transaction, another business deal, another negotiation. But Joe wasn't just the daughter he could push around anymore. She was the CEO of a thriving business, a woman who had turned her back on her father's toxic influence and built something far greater. And that's when she saw it clearly: her father's own destruction was self-inflicted. He had planted the seeds of his own downfall by underestimating her, by trying to keep her down. He thought that if he kept her on the sidelines, he could control her. He had no idea that the daughter he'd pushed aside was now the one holding the cards. That was the turning point. The point when Joe realized she didn't have to play by his rules anymore. The point when she understood that she could control her own fate. Tonight was the culmination of everything she had worked for. She was no longer at his mercy. She had power, real power. And it was time for him to learn that she wasn't the scared little girl he once knew. She had become something far stronger. Joe didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. The storm outside seemed to echo her resolve, the howling winds mirroring the storm inside her. She was ready to take the final step. And tonight, her father would learn what it meant to cross her. She had built herself up from nothing, and now she would finally tear him down. The tension in the room was palpable. James, her father, sat at the head of the table like a king on a crumbling throne, the glass of scotch in his hand, swirling lazily as he waited for Joe to break. He thought she would crumble, just like before. That scared, desperate girl who had once pleaded for his approval. But Joe wasn't that girl anymore, not by a long shot. She could feel his eyes on her, his impatience growing, the weight of his expectations pressing down on her. He thought this was just a transaction, a simple business deal where the power was his, where the daughter would obey as she always had. But Joe wasn't going to obey. She wasn't going to play along with his game anymore. Her fingers brushed the fountain pen on the table, its sleek silver surface reflecting the harsh light of the chandelier above. It was expensive. Everything in this room was expensive. Her father's wealth was his armor, and he wore it with arrogance, as if money could protect him from the world. But Joe wasn't intimidated. She wasn't even bothered by the suffocating silence. She was more focused on her next move. Her father had always underestimated her, thinking he could control her with threats and guilt trips. But she had learned something important in the years since he'd cast her aside. She could control the narrative. And tonight, she was going to rewrite the script. Joe took a breath, letting the silence stretch on for a few more seconds, letting him stew in his own arrogance. She didn't need to rush. He was the one who needed her. He was the one backed into a corner. Finally, she spoke. Her voice, calm, measured. "I'm not signing James." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. She could see the flicker of surprise in his eyes, the brief flash of panic before he quickly masked it with a sneer. He was used to getting what he wanted. He was used to pushing people around and watching them buckle under pressure. But Joe wasn't going to buckle. She wasn't scared of him anymore. "Stop stalling, Joe Costa!" He barked, his voice low and dangerous. "The ink is drying. Sign the damn loan and we can forget this whole thing. We become a family again." Family. The word almost made her laugh. It had been years since she'd felt any connection to this man. He had made it clear long ago that family was just a tool to him, a means to an end. There was no love, no loyalty, just power. And power wasn't something Joe needed from him anymore. She had built her own. Joe kept her eyes on him, her gaze unwavering. "Family," she repeated, her voice a little colder now. "Is that what you call it?" She remembered that day 3 years ago, the day her father had torn apart her wedding and sent her down a path of humiliation and betrayal. He had thought it would break her, but instead it had forged something far stronger. She wasn't going to let him break her anymore, and she wasn't going to let him destroy her life again. She reached into her bag, feeling the weight of the document inside. She could almost feel her father's eyes following her every move. He was expecting her to pull out the loan agreement to give in to the pressure. But Joe wasn't playing by his rules anymore. She slid the document across the table, the sound of the paper dragging against the mahogany, sending a small thrill through her. The moment had come. She leaned back in her chair, watching as her father's fingers hesitated over the paper. "What is this?" he asked, picking up the document with 2 fingers, as if it might bite him. Joe's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "It's a notice of assignment," she said softly. Her father's face twisted into a frown. "What the hell are you talking about?" 2 weeks ago, I acquired your debt portfolio." Joe said, her tone flat and casual, as if she were discussing something mundane. But the shock on her father's face told her everything she needed to know. She had him. "You can't be serious," he sneered, trying to maintain control, but the cracks were starting to show. "I bank with Chase. You used to bank with Chase." "Not anymore," Joe said, her voice cool. "In 2019, they blacklisted you after the audit. You've been floating your company and this lifestyle on high-interest loans from Vantage Capital, a predatory hard money lender." Her father's face drained of color. He knew Vantage. He knew them because they were the sharks he had swum with when the legitimate banks had locked their doors. She had him cornered now. She could see the panic beginning to seep into his eyes. "I called them up." Joe continued, her tone conversational, almost bored. "I offered to buy the promissory note on this estate and your company's primary liability. They were happy to unload a bad asset. I didn't get it for pennies on the dollar, James. I paid a premium $12.5 million in cash wired same day." The horror on his face was almost satisfying. The man who had thought he controlled everything, the man who had never once believed his daughter was capable of outsmarting him, was now realizing just how wrong he had been. Joe wasn't the scared girl he had tossed aside. She was the one holding the power now. "Why?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Because I wanted to own you," Joe said, her voice low, cold. "Technically, I'm now your senior lien holder. I own the mortgage on this house. I own the debt on your company. I own the chair you're sitting in." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a cloud ready to burst. Her father looked at the paper again, his eyes darting between the document and Joe's calm expression. He was floundering now, the self-assurance he had carried for so many years, slipping away piece by piece. "This is illegal," he spat, slamming the paper down on the table. "You can't just... It's perfectly legal." Joe interrupted, cutting him off with a quiet authority that made him falter. And here's the reality: your note is in default. You've missed the last 3 payments. Vantage was going to foreclose next month anyway. I just sped up the timeline. Her father's face twisted in disbelief. He couldn't believe what was happening. He couldn't believe his own daughter had outplayed him. Joe stood up slowly, watching his panic grow as she walked to the window. The storm outside raged against the glass, and for the first time, Joe felt calm. The storm inside her had finally settled. "You have 2 options," Joe said, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "Option A, you wire the full principal plus interest, about $14 million, into my account by midnight. Option B, I enforce the default. I seize the collateral." She turned back to face him, her gaze unflinching. "Which means I take the company and I take this house." As the confrontation between Joe and her father escalated, her attention shifted momentarily to her brother Thomas, who sat silently in the corner, his fingers still nervously tapping on his phone. He was the golden child, the one who had never been expected to work for anything, the one who had been handed everything he'd ever wanted. But in this moment, Joe saw him differently. He wasn't the pampered little brother she remembered. He was a pawn. He didn't even understand the weight of the situation. He had been so thoroughly groomed by their father, so conditioned by years of emotional manipulation, that he had become a tool without even knowing it. Joe's eyes narrowed as she looked at him, the realization dawning. Her father had sacrificed his own son for his financial schemes. It was a thought that twisted something cold inside her. How could James do that to his own flesh and blood? The answer was simple. To James, everyone, his wife, his children, was just an asset. The only thing that mattered was money, and the lengths he was willing to go to maintain his empire were limitless. As Joe's gaze shifted back to her father, her voice turned sharp. "Thomas," she called softly, her words carrying a weight that made him hesitate. The sound of his name, spoken with such quiet authority, seemed to snap him out of his trance. He looked up at her, his face pale, his eyes shifting between Joe and their father. Joe's heart clenched as she saw the confusion in his eyes. He didn't understand yet. He didn't see the bigger picture. She could feel the anger rise within her, but she pushed it down, focusing on the truth. "Did you make these deposits?" she asked, her voice calm but cutting through the tension like a knife. Thomas swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to get caught in his throat. He glanced at their father as if searching for some kind of reassurance. James didn't offer him any. He was too busy trying to salvage what little control he had left. I deposited the envelopes Dad gave me," Thomas muttered, his voice cracking. "He said you were in trouble," he added, almost as if to justify his actions. Joe's eyes narrowed. Her father had spun a web of lies so intricate, so convincing, that Thomas had fallen for it without question. "You did it because he told you it was necessary," Joe said, her voice laced with disgust. "Because he said you had to help me, anonymously." Thomas nodded weakly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He looked lost, like a child who had been made to carry a heavy burden far too great for him. "He called it the Legacy Protection Fund," he added, his voice barely a whisper. Joe shook her head, her mind reeling with the implications. She had known her father was ruthless, but this was something entirely different. He had manipulated Thomas, had turned him into a weapon without his even knowing it. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. It was about keeping Thomas soft, pliable, and most of all obedient. For 26 years, James had sheltered Thomas from any real consequence, shielding him from the harsh realities of the world so that he could use him when the time was right. And now that time had come. Jo's eyes flicked back to her father, her gaze as cold as the storm raging outside. She was repulsed, but she wasn't surprised. She knew exactly how James operated now. Thomas was nothing more than an extension of his power, a tool to be used and discarded when necessary. James didn't love his son. He consumed him just like he had consumed everyone else in his life. Thomas was the perfect pawn, the perfect person to carry out the dirty work without ever realizing the full consequences of his actions. Jo took a deep breath, her voice steady as she spoke. "You used him, James," she said, her words slicing through the air. "You set up your own son to commit a federal crime just to frame me." James didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply shrugged as if it were all part of the plan. "He's a good boy," he said dismissively, glancing over at Thomas. "He does what he's told, unlike you." Thomas stared at their father, his face crumpling as the weight of the truth sank in. "Dad, you told me it was legal," he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and fear. "You said it was a gift tax loophole." James didn't even look at him. He was too focused on Jo, too focused on salvaging his last shred of dignity. "Shut up, Thomas," he snapped, his voice cold. "You don't understand." But Jo saw the fear in Thomas's eyes. He was slowly realizing that he had been nothing more than a tool in their father's twisted game. And in that moment, Jo realized just how far James would go to keep his empire intact. He would sacrifice anyone, his wife, his children, without a second thought. And Thomas, in his innocence, had become the collateral damage. Jo felt a pang of pity for her brother, but it was quickly overshadowed by her anger. She wasn't going to let him be the scapegoat. Not now. Not ever. "You used him?" she repeated, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "He didn't even know what he was doing. You groomed him, James. You made him a weapon, and now you're going to let him fall." Thomas's face twisted in anguish, and for the first time, Jo saw him for what he truly was, a victim of their father's manipulation. He wasn't a co-conspirator. He was just a pawn, and James had used him to further his own twisted plans. Jo's heart hardened. This was it, the final straw. She wasn't going to let their father destroy any more lives, not hers, not Thomas's, not anyone's. Jo could feel the weight of the room shift the air thick with the tension of impending reckoning. Her father, who had always prided himself on being the master of the game, was now staring at her with a look of sheer disbelief. He had underestimated her for so long. He had thought that by controlling the narrative, by forcing her hand, he could bend her to his will once again. But Jo wasn't playing by his rules. She was playing her own. The truth was, she had been preparing for this moment long before tonight. While her father had been preoccupied with maintaining his fragile empire, Jo had been watching, calculating, tracking every move he made, every financial misstep. Her background in forensic accounting had been more than just a job. It had become a weapon. A weapon that she had sharpened in the shadows, waiting for the right time to strike. And now, the time had come. She stood tall, her eyes locked on her father's as she took a breath, feeling the power shift in her favor. "You think you have control, James?" Jo said, her voice steady. "But you don't. I've already won." James scoffed, his disbelief transforming into anger. "You don't have anything on me. He spat, trying to claw back the control he was losing. But Joe wasn't fooled by his bravado. She knew the truth. She knew exactly what he had been hiding. With a cool calmness, she pulled out her phone, swiping across the screen with practiced ease. Her father's eyes narrowed as he watched her, the unease growing with each second. Joe didn't need to say another word. She slid the phone across the table, stopping it just in front of him. He glanced down at the screen, and the color drained from his face. It was a financial crimes report filed with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. She had anticipated his every move, his every attempt to cover up his tracks, and she had already acted. 6 weeks ago, I filed a suspicious activity report. Joe said, her voice unwavering. I saw the structuring. I saw the cash deposits. I reported it. Her father's eyes flickered to the screen, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the device. He couldn't deny it. The evidence was right there in black and white. He had thought he was one step ahead, but Joe had already anticipated his next move. She had outplayed him, outsmarted him at his own game. You've been laundering money through my accounts for years, James? Joe continued her words, cutting through the room like a knife. But now the truth is out. The FBI knows everything. For a moment, there was silence, only the sound of the storm outside crashing against the windows. Joe could see the panic begin to set in the cracks in her father's facade widening. His empire was collapsing around him, and for the first time he realized he had nowhere left to run. He looked at Joe, his expression a mixture of fear and fury. She wasn't the girl he had cast aside. She wasn't the daughter he could control anymore. She was a force of her own, and now he had to face the consequences of everything he had done. The power had shifted entirely. Joe was in control, and her father knew it. The game was over. He had lost. As Joe stood there watching her father crumble before her, something shifted inside her. The weight she had carried for so long, the anger, the betrayal, the shame began to lift. She had spent years feeling trapped by his toxic influence, bound by the belief that his power was unstoppable, that she would always be at his mercy. But tonight she had rewritten that story. She had taken back control of her own destiny. For the first time in her life, she felt free. Free from the chains he had wrapped around her. Free from the suffocating expectations. Free from the fear that had once defined her existence. She glanced at Caleb, her husband, standing quietly by the door, his eyes never leaving her. He had been there through it all, a constant support, a reminder that love and loyalty could still exist even in the darkest of places. Together they had fought for this moment, and now it was theirs. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a reminder of the life she had built, one that didn't rely on the toxic legacy her father had tried to leave her with. The storm outside had calmed, and so had the storm inside her. Joe felt a peace she had never known. She wasn't just walking away from her father's destruction. She was walking toward her own future, a future that was hers to shape. As she looked back at the shattered man sitting in the corner, Joe couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. He had thought he could break her. He had thought he could control her. But she had proved him wrong. She had found her strength, her voice, and in doing so, she had found herself. And maybe that was the greatest victory of all. If you've ever felt trapped by someone or something, know that there's always a way out. Take control of your story. Stand up for what you believe in. And remember, sometimes the best way to move forward is to leave the past behind. If you've enjoyed this story, feel free to like and subscribe. It's never easy to take control, but if Joe's journey has taught us anything, it's that the power to change our lives is always within reach.